Can you understand me? Yes. Okay. Hello, and thank you for this event. I think it's really important that people talk about this issue so that something can change. When I was a child, I dreamt to be a sea biologist. I dreamt to be loved, to be respected, but I never dreamed about being abused and used by sex buyers. But this was how it came to me. As a minor, I was a trafficker started to recruit me into prostitution through so-called lover boy method. This strategy is about targeted searching, recruiting, and pushing especially young women into prostitution for the purpose to exploit them there by faking, simulating a love relationship at the beginning. This form of recruiting is the safest way for the traffickers to escape prosecution, said Helmut Sporer, German police officer, because the traffickers can hide behind the alleged voluntariness of the prostituted women that are under their control. So I stayed 6 years in prostitution. And when I prepared my speech for today, I asked myself, what should I tell you? That you can understand what is happening in Germany and also in other countries which have the same or similar liberal legislation on prostitution as Germany. You know, for many people, Germany seems to be a modern country with a free democratic basic order and where human rights are protected. The protection of human dignity is the first article in our constitution. But the sad truth is, in my 6 years in prostitution, I never saw prostituted women's dignity. Their dignity was taken away by pimps, by traffickers, and especially by sex buyers, because sex buyers are the ones who break the prostituted women's will and deprive them of their dignity through the sexual act. And sex buyers are no special sort of men. They are our fellow citizens, acquaintances, friends, work colleagues, and family members, often husbands with children, who by abusing the women are guilty of the daily destruction of thousands, and in Germany hundreds of thousands of women who are in prostitution. So what is with the argument legal makes it safer? Does it? Is there less violence, pimping, trafficking, organized crime in a state like Germany with its liberal law on prostitution and its legal brothels? I want to tell you the beginning of my prostitution experience so that you realize how Germany's liberal legislation on prostitution is a push factor for human trafficking. When my trafficker pushed me for the first time into a legal brothel during my recruitment as a young woman, I had a very bad intuition and I wanted to escape. I was young, unstable, and I didn't know how to hold myself and in which kind of dangerous situation I was. He led me towards prostitution and said, I should not be embarrassed, it is all normal, he said. And then I remembered the point of our government, which considers prostitution as a job, and that pimps as well as brothel owners appear on talk shows being called businessmen instead of criminals. I remembered that prostitution was mainly described as not so bad at all, and that there is a way to practice prostitution without harm. Prostitution is legal and liberal. There are legal brothels everywhere, so it can't be so bad, I thought. Exactly this image of normality of prostitution is transmitted with Germany's liberal prostitution laws, and so I could not recognize that I was on the way sliding into the middle of a criminal milieu full of violence. Prostitution was not named as violence, and it is still not named as violence in Germany and elsewhere. They always make a difference between forced prostitution and free choice prostitution. But as Rachel has already said, What happens in the room is always unconsensual sex. However, states have the responsibility to be a role model and provider of orientation, especially for young and vulnerable people, as I was one of them. If Germany had told me with a prohibition of buying sex, prostitution is dangerous, violence, and a violation of human dignity, the trafficker would have had it much harder to lead me into prostitution and to lead others also in prostitution, because in Germany the lover boy method is very, very common. On a global level, there is a consent to abolish trafficking. People speak about push and pull factors that facilitates human trafficking. So when we talk about push and pull factors for human trafficking and also prostitution, push factors are, for example, different forms of violence, a dysfunctional family, abuse, persecution, unemployment, conflict and war, gender or other discrimination. These factors push the women more into the direction of prostitution because they are vulnerable. And if they are in a situation of this vulnerability, it's easier for the traffickers to traffic them. So we come to the pull factors. The pull factors are very often, for example, false promises like high salary, good working conditions. The lover boy method is also a pull factor. Love is promised, a future is promised. So why I explain this is because I want to make clear that the liberal prostitution legislation in Germany is a push factor for human trafficking. It makes it easier for traffickers to pull their victims into prostitution, as you can see in my example above. So, another point, why is prostitution no job? For me, the inhibition threshold to get intimate with the first sex buyer was very, very high. Feelings like disgust and nausea, shame, grief, and fear made it nearly impossible for me to do it. I nearly began screaming and crying, but when the act was over, something inside of me got destroyed. I wanted to cry, but I could not do it anymore. My feelings were numbed and killed. The ability to defend and resist gets more and more lost the more sex buyers you have, because of the unwanted penetration. The act of penetration means a permanent humiliation and degradation as an object of sexual use. You are deprived of human dignity and stop noticing yourself as a human with feelings. I was, for example, in a flat rate brothel, which you have already seen on Dr. Krau's presentation, where I had 400, 500 sex buyers only in 4 weeks. It has done something to me. They took my worth, my dignity, and myself. I didn't feel like a human being. I had lost the power to resist because they destroyed me. And I'm not only talking about me, but about all the prostituted women I met in prostitution. For the women I personally met, and I met hundreds of them in these 6 years, prostitution itself was an act of violence. Most of them had lost their capacity of being a person with desires, needs, emotions. Because if you have to turn this always off in prostitution to be able to survive the moment, it starts to stay off automatically because it hurts less. In such a situation, you cannot just change into a normal life as if nothing has happened, because you carry this loss of dignity and soul in yourself, and you are mentally caught in this world. The humiliation, commodification, the belief of being worth, of not being worth anything than prostitution, the doubts after all these experiences that after such a past You will not be able to have a life which is a life, in which you are accepted by society. All these factors are factors which are keeping the most vulnerable ones in prostitution. And this is also often called a free choice. The pain of the women and the violence of the traffickers become invisible behind those two magic words. I also said that I was in prostitution by free choice, and I didn't know what prostitution will do to me. Prostitution did not break me after 6 years in prostitution, but it broke me immediately after the first sex buyer, and then constantly deeper. But the pain came out only after years, because I was disconnected before to myself, and this already after the first sex buyer. Now I want to tell you what prostitution did to me. It affected me, my psyche, my soul, my body, my ability to talk, to think, and to exist. I had daily panic attacks, flashbacks, and because of the trauma, my muscles stopped working, so that I was not even able to walk and to hold my head upright. I also had a lot of problems with dissociative phenomena. I had the feeling of not really being present, and that all senses are dampened, like being in cotton wool. I noticed myself and my life as behind a soundproof wall of glass. I was walking through life like through a tunnel. So with dissociation one feels fewer soul and body pains. That is the goal. I was permanently in a trance-like state, and it took a long time, a very long time, to let go of this automatically strong protection, so that I could finally feel myself and the life around me with full senses again. What I and other women experienced in Germany in prostitution, with Germany's liberal prostitution law, is state-tolerated sexual abuse. It's the normalization of treating people as commodities and objects. It's the normalization, you know what one former sex buyer said? His name is Gene McConnell, and I met him a few weeks before in Berlin. He comes from the US and is a former sex buyer, and he talked about his experience as sex buyer, and he described it like this. Once you pay for a prostituted woman, she is an object. And if you are treating persons as objects, it doesn't matter to you if they feel pain, if they are hurt, if they have feelings. You do with them whatever you want, because for you, they are no human beings in this moment. They are just objects. But women are no objects. They are never objects. And a state and a society cannot allow men to make objects out of them only because they are vulnerable, poor, a minority, abused as a child, and so on, which are all preconditions and push factors. It's the duty of a state to protect them and to prevent their exploitation in prostitution. There must be more states who are fighting for their dignity instead of giving up and legalizing, liberalizing the prostitution system with Brussels, etc., which abuses them. With a liberal handling of prostitution, also traffickers will not disappear. They go over to less visible forms of trafficking, like the lover boy method, and hide themselves behind the legal structures and the alleged voluntariness of the prostituted women. That is what the European Commission said in a report of 2016. There is an enormous exploitation in Germany of children and women, but when it's legal, you cannot see it that much. One police officer, Manfred Paulo, said that competent police officers assume that 96 to 98% in Germany's prostitution are not in prostitution because they want to be there. To believe that you can control what happens in brothels is a misbelief. In Germany we can't, and you will never be able to control the trafficking in brothels. Most of the brothel owners know that the women who are in their brothel are trafficked because they know who is walking in their doors and bringing the girls. The brothel owners need the traffickers because otherwise most of them must close their brothels, because without the traffickers' help there won't be enough prostituted women, and this would mean the financial ruin, how you can see in the case Dr. Krauss has talked about. So forget about this idea that young women ring on the brothel's bell asking for a job. It doesn't work like this. At least I haven't seen it like this in Germany. All women I saw in brothels were put there by men, by traffickers, by pimps. If you legalize everything, you will create an enormous increase of demand, which is a breeding ground for traffickers. This means you will have an enormous increase of trafficking, which you maybe cannot see in its dimension because of the legal structures. Numbers of studies have proven that illegal prostitution increases when prostitution is legalized, and that legalization is a failed experiment. Also, the European Parliament said that we have to adopt the Swedish model, as we heard already before. So last year I was in France, and as you surely know, they have implemented the Nordic model in 2016. If someone was in prostitution like me, you can feel the victory of justice in the air when you walk through France streets. I could breathe easier, I had more space, security, and freedom than anywhere else. People who have never been in prostitution may not be able to empathize with what it means for people like me to be in a country like France, where it is forbidden to buy sex, from which I know that it has destroyed countless women, and from which I know that it is destroying thousands more each day. All countries who have not implemented the Nordic model yet really had to change their direction. Also in the sense that they should not distinguish between the terms forced prostitution and prostitution when it comes to the question if people are for sale or not, because no human being should be for sale for sexual use. It is against human dignity, and I would like to say it in the words of the European Parliament: prostitution is a very obvious and especially abhorrent violation of human dignity. And actually, if you are honest to yourself, you all know this, at least somewhere deep inside you. Nobody wants to have his or her daughter in prostitution. You don't want people you love in prostitution because you can imagine that the money exchange doesn't make it consensual sex. Opening brothels will not make it safer. The brothels in Germany are similar to rape camps, but nobody is seeing the rape because it takes place behind doors in legal brothels. Organized crime in Germany's brothels is omnipresent, but because of legality, it's hardly impossible to fight them. In every brothel I was, almost all women were trafficked. And also, when they were not trafficked, I never saw a good prostitution. Sometimes I wish I could use a camera to capture my life in prostitution every single day, our life, the lives of all of the prostituted women who have experienced it. Then you could have seen what we are talking about. I don't know what kind of society you want to live in, but I want to live in a society where childhood dreams like mine are not destroyed by ending up in prostitution. I don't want to live in a society where young men grow up with the image of women that they are for sale anytime, that they can be bought, used, and then thrown away. I want to live in a society that names violence and is a role model for young people, as I was one of them. When I was young, I needed a state where I could have orientated myself, a state that would have protected me at a time when I was not able to protect myself. I had no such state with Germany. But I please you to become such a state for all the young people in your country. So there is only one option, and it is to adopt the Nordic model. Thank you.